And again, I'd like to also welcome everybody to this afternoon's webinar. I think it's an exciting topic as we were trying to plan for this year's series on organic and sustainable agriculture topics. We tried to put a special emphasis on livestock, as today's presentation will clearly indicate, along with the one in April about integrating livestock into a cropping system. So, real brief about our presenter. Greg is an old-timer like me. He's got 34 years of NRCS experience, but yet you'll find excitement in his voice even after all those years. He's been the state grazing specialist of Tennessee for over 18 years, and before that he was the district conservationist at various locations in Tennessee. And Greg has just accepted a new responsibility. He's going to be Tennessee's state soil health specialist. So congratulations on that, Greg. I'm sure you'll do a great job on that. And in addition to that, to add some more credibility, what Greg's got to say, not only does he know it, he can talk the talk. He also walks it as he manages his 350 acres of pasture that he's going to be describing throughout his presentation. So, without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Greg.
Okay, thanks, David. I appreciate the Eastern National Technical Sports Center having me join them, and I also appreciate people joining the conference and listening in. In my lifetime, I can't remember a more exciting time to be in agriculture. It's just really neat that we're rediscovering sustainable ag, and we've advanced as well. So I think we've got so many tools to work with today, and I hate to take any of them from the toolbox, but the challenge is to keep it simple. Typically, management is the weak link, and as we focus on soil health and manage cover, green and brown, and try to keep it fresh, like with rotational grazing, I like a 3-day rotation or less. Then also manure distribution and grazing distribution are other focuses that I think are so important today. This presentation will be presented more from a producer view than a grazing specialist view, but they'll overlap. Wanted to give a little background. My dad bought the farm in the 60s, and was a cattle producer. And then about 2005, my brother and I took over management of the operation, and the first thing was to reinstall perimeter fence. He'd let it get rather ragged and dilapidated, and so right off we said we might as well fence for multi-species. And so we started that, and I'll go through the evolution of this cattle farm to a multi-species farm will be part of the presentation. He got up to about 300 cows and rotated about once a week. In my opinion, grazed a little close. But I do appreciate what he did and what land we had to begin with to start with. Starting off with some reasons for multi-species grazing. Weed control, they become forbs if the other animals eat them. It's not going to control all weeds or all plants. Like there's still Jimson weed, cocklebur, but some of the worst ones are nimblewheel, perilla mint, and wing stem that I have some issues with. And we'll address those with trampling, or we can have them eat them, but we have to realize we're sacrificing some animal performance when we make the animals do a job. Nutrient recycling, that's always a focus. It's so important, and we'll look at some numbers in that as well and the value of it. The hay savings. Sheep on one operation on the home farm, they hardly ever eat hay. We keep some standing grass most all year, so it cut the hay way back, and of course the rotation helps in that regard too. The cattle, how they avoid grazing next to where they've defecated. Well, the sheep and goats don't hesitate to graze that area. Now, the sheep and goats don't avoid grazing next to their own poop and all, so that's not an issue other than we'd rather them avoid it a little bit so they didn't pick up internal parasitocsidiosis. But they don't share parasites between cattle and goats or cattle and sheep. Now, goats and sheep do share internal parasites. Increased stocking rate is another benefit. You can run 1 to 2 goats for every cow without affecting the grazing of the cow, and actually you'll improve the grazing, because if it's not a briar there, if it's not as tall of a briar, you'll be growing more grass and clover. And goats don't like clover, so it increases in the system, so that's another benefit. Now the sheep, you could probably, my estimate, and this is just an estimate, is 1 ewe for 2 cows would be, I think, reasonable to not affect the grazing of the cow. Increased income, with the increase, all these other benefits, you're going to get some increased income. Then fun and entertaining, you'll see some pictures of some hogs. I just added a few hogs one time, and very entertaining to watch them. More reasons for adding the small ruminants. The gestation period is a big factor. The 5-month gestation period just is a quick turn, and then they can breed back, or they can be bred at 10 months old. So a ewe lamb can be bred at 10 months, and the goats are a little less successful at breeding at 10 months, but they can too. And you don't have the lambing or kidding problems that you do with heifers, so we rarely pull any small ruminant babies. We average about 1.7 babies per female, and that's pretty good. You want to beat the 1.5 if you can. Another benefit is they'll wean, or at 10 months of age, they'll have enough in the babies, like the lambs, that will equal the mother's weight. I don't know of another species that can do that. And dollars per pound when you go to sell them at the auction in this area are equal to cattle or even higher. Goats right now are the highest selling species. So I'm going to go through a little evolution of how we went from a cattle farm to a multi-species farm. We focused on the boundary fence, but the first animals that came in, we put in what we call the hub, or I call the hub, and it was woven wire. I don't have much woven wire on the place, but I do put woven wire up in this hub or catch pen, because it's always nice to be able to lock them down if needed. Now, we use mainly high tensile wire, and the lowest wire is the most important, and usually it's run I run it at 7 inches off the ground is the target, but 6 to 8 inches off the ground is important. And then from the hub, we started off using electronet and making paddocks coming away from the hub area. That's how we started. Now we use 3 electric poly wires for some temporary fencing. We'll use some electronet, and then the permanent fence is 4 strands of high tensile radiating from the hub. And I'm not talking about a pie shape, but they lead the animals back to the hub or corral area. We started off with cattle. We added the goats, and then we added sheep, and we're so pleased with the sheep we added more sheep. And now that I have about 300 ewes, that amounts to about 800 or 900 animals when you count the lambs. And that's so many in one herd that I've gone back to cattle. And the cattle are more impressive now that we've culled back and got better genetics. No hay is made on the farm because the value of hay is, we like to bring in those nutrients. It's about $25 worth of nutrients brought in a roll of a 1,000-pound roll of hay. The break-even price of hay is $80 to $120 a ton, and we can get it delivered for $35 a roll. So it just makes sense to buy the hay, and we want to graze those fields. here's a current inventory of what we have on the place, and it's very dynamic. It goes up and down. Part of the philosophy is to keep fewer females and keep the calves longer. And we'll even since everything's grass fed and we don't feed any grain, it takes a while to get the lambs up to 70 or 80 pounds. So we keep them a little longer than the people that creep feed or feed their lambs. But usually we grade well when they're number twos at the market, and we will talk to direct marketers and give them an opportunity to buy some. I'm getting ahead of myself. I've got that further on. But on the home farm, we've got 16 permanent paddocks, and we'll divide that up with temporary fence and make 45 throughout the year. I wanted to point out the goal of this particular operation is a low-cost, low-stress grazing operation that improves production and the environment while being consistently profitable. So that's what we try to think about in all the tasks that we do. Okay, when we introduce a new species to the farm, lately I brought in a llama, and we'll put it in the hub, the woven wire area, and it has offset electric, gets them used to the electric fence. And then we'll graze the herd beside of them, and they give them a strange look for a while, and then after about 3 days, we'll turn them out, but we'll turn them out when we rotate the whole herd to a new paddock so they're not defending the paddock they're on. And they're preoccupied with the fresh grass. And you'll see a little, little arguments between the new species and checking each other out, but they'll find their place in the pecking order. And the llama connected more with the cattle than the sheep and goats, which is not what I wanted, but it's okay. The cattle serve as predator control too. Animal type and number of each species, again, it's very dynamic. Base the goats stocking rate on ironweed is my key species. I want it to be about 2 foot high or less, but I don't want it to disappear because it is a forb and a forage, and I just don't want it to be dominant. And then the sheep, they're broad diet, and they key in on buttercup, but as the grass increases, we'll increase the cattle. And like I say, the cattle have improved, and we've got a deep body, wide body, and then we're selecting also trying to pay more attention to their mouth and long head, and we've got some good stock now. This is a view from the past. This is back when we had single wire for the cattle, and the goats would go under the wires before we got sheep. 2006, and we started buying goats in 2005. Somewhat a dry time there, but the cattle are held back with that one wire, so the goats were always the first grazer, which is not that bad with goats, but when we added the sheep, it became more competitive for the cattle, and you could see the body condition dropping somewhat with the cattle. Yeah, that's good. I'm going to go through the months of the year, and I thought it'd be the best way to show different management techniques throughout the year. One technique we use sometime is bale grazing. 42-inch high wire will hold my cows back as electric wire, and so the steers can forward graze, and then, or if we're feeding hay, they'll have a little better hay than the cows, and because the cows are dry. And then the goats and sheep are also going under there getting the better hay, and they require a little higher quality diet too. And then 3-wire polywire will hold back the sheep and goats. And that 3-wire, we space it 7 inches off the ground, then 8, and then 12. That holds everything back real well. If we want something for the special mineral for the goats and sheep, we'll put it between the 34-inch wire and the 3 poly wires. Well, when we place rows out in rings, we'll put it on weedy spots or low fertility spots. That's a big part. Every time we place a row, we try to think about that, and we always put it in a new location every time we place a row on the farm. We continue the rotation throughout the year, rotating about every 3 days. That'll differ throughout the year, but usually about three-day rotation is the target. More and more we fence the long direction and leave the polywire up longer, and then we'll still cross fence with some temporary wire between two long parallels. Here you can see in this picture that the cattle condition is a little off, and look at the sheep, a very high condition. So that's when we don't do this anymore much. We rarely use a single wire and hold the cows back because we're seeing their condition drop too much. Now we run them all as one herd and use the 3-wire polywire or permanent fencing. And boy, combining herds makes everything very simple. And it's one-stop check of mineral and water and forage and hay. It's just a lot easier. If you did run multiple herds, then I would recommend doing grazing whichever species lactating or first, and leave some, just top graze it, then leave some for the next, be right behind each herd. Otherwise, if you got herds all over the place, your recovery period is cut short.
Hey, Greg, got a question come in about does having a mixed herd like that reduce your predator problems with coyotes or wild dogs or anything like that on your sheep?
I really think it does, big time. The cows, especially if they have a little Brahma blood in them, they don't like dogs or coyotes coming in. And then I've even had the cows break up a dog fight between the guardians. So I've got another place that I rent, and it doesn't have cattle on it, and I'm going to add cattle because we're having a little predator issue there. So, and when you combine it, like I had a cow with a sore foot and a lamb with a sore foot, and I had them in the same pen together, and that lamb would use the cow as a defense from me catching it. So, yeah, it definitely is beneficial. But it's much easier to manage the forage and recovery period when you just have the one herd. So I'm pretty strong on that. Disadvantage is you can't target grazing as much as you might like when you have them all as one group. The point of this slide is to point out how important it is to keep the water level high in the tanks. When the small lambs or kids are drinking, they could fall over in there and have trouble getting out. I had an incident, I hate to admit, where I lost several lambs. I first put a ramp in there with some welded wire cloth on it, and I didn't extend it down into the water, but that wasn't the issue, I don't think. But anyway, I found some more dead, and then I put blocks in there. I still found some dead in the tire tank. And then I raised the water level up to within 2 inches of the top, and that's very important because if they have to lean over in there, this trough here is not filled enough in the picture. It really needs to be within inches of the lip of the trough. That would be a benefit. This is some rye that was interseeded into some Bermuda grass and clover, and yeah, they tromped a lot down, but it's carbon returning to the surface and feeding the microbes, keeping it cooler, and also the moisture conservation. So we look at that as a benefit. We don't want everything consumed. Fertilizer savings, I hadn't fertilized in going on 6 years now, and used to fertilize regularly. We do watch and monitor. We soil test regular, and we don't want it slipping out of the medium category, and we'll keep our pH up with lime. Hay savings, again, the sheep are not big hay eaters, so we've saved a lot with that. And we've increased the stocking rate on the home farm 38%, overall 13%.
Hey, Greg, got a question came in about the waterers real quick. Have you tried using any of those mirror mount or those other kind of frost-proof type of waterers?
Yeah.
With,
those work fine. Now the balls that stand up, they're since they're not as strong, it's a little harder for them to push those down. Now you could take the balls out, or you could put them down permanently, and they'd work. But they learn to drink out of all of them. I really prefer the little 55-gallon Rubbermaid trough is probably my favorite trough, and we'll see some pictures of that too. But they'll drink out of everything. Sometimes I'll put blocks around the trough to be sure they can get up there to get the water. But the balls are not supposed to be tight on those ball waters anyway, so they'll figure it out. I hadn't had issues with that. On this slide here, this is the rented farm, and you can see it's got a good grazing height. I used to think that was the most important thing, but due to having only 4 paddocks, it's hard for me to freshen up the grass, give it that rest period it needs. So they get to the point where they reject it a little bit and just don't do as well as they could. And this is this past July or early July. We had some real hot weather in the hundreds, and you can see the fescue just browned out. And fescue is pretty worthless. Now, the animal that fell apart the most, I didn't feed any hay. I was fixing to feed hay right when it rained, but the sheep began to have runny eyes. In fact, I thought it was going to be a disaster, so I was afraid to rotate away from the corral. But we just started rotating faster, and because we thought we were going to have to give an antibiotic, but their nutrition improved. We got some rain, and their eyes cleared up. So this is just in early August after the rains. You see we got a big response, regrowth. This is Sericea natural tannins. It's a natural dewormer. The briars, this hadn't been mowed probably in a couple of years, and you can see with goats you can set the height you want it grazed. If you want it grazed 2 foot, it'd be one stocking rate. If you want it grazed 8 inches, it'd be another stocking rate because they graze from the top down. Really, Sericea is not a preferred plant. They do graze it, but if they've got choice, it's not going to be the most preferred plant. Here's some briars, and this fescue is way too mature, of course, but you can see how they hone in on the briars, and these briars are in trouble. If we wanted to kill them, we'd stay on this, and they would keep getting that little bud, and these briars would die. We want to keep the briars about 1 foot to no more than 3 foot tall. Fescue, the fungus endophytes the strongest in the seed head. Goats are really drawn to the seed heads, and doesn't seem to affect them as much as it does the cattle. So that's another benefit of having the multi-species. I grazed some corn this last year and was rather pleased with that. We just planted feed corn, and if I'd had time, I would have done a germination test on it, and I would recommend anybody do that. But we planted it with a drill and planted 150,000 plant population. That's about 5 times higher than the grain producers plant. When I turned the animals in, you can see they weren't used to it, and they were grazing around the edge. They didn't jump in on the corn, but later that day it looked a little different. They really got into it, and we strip grazed it, and you can see the sheep there. Now the cattle are back in the corn a little bit, I believe. We just knocked down the corn with my truck and then put up the 3-wire poly fence, and you see 4 insulators on there, but there's only 3 wires, and we're using the braided poly wire now. I wouldn't recommend these red pigtails. They tend to break down on me, at least the brand I bought, so I'd get the white ones. Wanted to point out how the different grazing nature of the animals. Sheep, the heads are down in the background there, and the goats, their heads are high, and they naturally segregate too, you can see. Now there'll be a little overlap, but the cattle are back in the corn. They're probably eating the ears. This is overgrazed. I don't like seeing anything like this. This is we didn't back fence. We just let them come back to water, and this was definitely too much grazed. But in that last picture, you probably saw the. Let's see if I can go back. There's some spiny amaranth in here, and you can see that they really took it out. There's nothing left. So I guess reaching for the light, it was succulent, and they ate everything. I wanted to point out a steer I harvested this last year, and I overdid it. He was high choice. I'd really wanted him to be the low choice, and he was 36 months old. I just kept waiting for him to get fat, and after grazing 18 days on the corn is when we harvest him. But he's got some tail fat cover and got some fat in the brisket. I thought it'd be worth pointing that out. Here's looking at the segregation of the animals too, and see how the cattle they're on the top of the hill. There's no fence. I've just drawn these lines to show the segregation, and the sheep are in the middle hill, mid slope, and then the goats are lower slope. There's more briars in that lower area. I think that's why they're there. I wanted to point out ear tagging technique. We use a red ear tag to signify something we're wanting to sell, and we just keep an eye on, and they're a bad actor. Then I use an ear notching technique. It's really on the tag, but if they have a limp, and then we'll notch the bottom of the tag. If it's bad FOMACHA score, anemic, then we'll notch it closest to the ear, to the eye, and then if it's bad hair coat with sheep, usually then we would notch the top. We don't cull real hard on that. And then if it's a messy tail and only 20% or less have a messy tail, we'll notch the back toward away from the eye.
Hey, Greg, before you move on past the corn too far, have you is there a magic time when you try and turn them into that, or you ever let them wait until the corn's a little more mature, or how do you judge when's the best?
Yeah, my understanding is the nutrients in the corn, the nutritional value is about the same no matter when you graze it, so you just use it when you need it. I used it in August, about 90 days after planting, and it was in the, I'd call it the nubbin stage. I didn't want it to be in the grain stage. I tend to my target on all grazing, if it could happen, is to graze at the boot stage. I think that's the compromise of quality and laying down biomass. But you can graze. One way of doing the corn is graze at that V5 stage, counting the leaves except for the whorl, and that'll make it sprout, or not sprout, but tip, and give you a heavier plant population. But after that, the growing point's too high, and you would kill the corn. But the nutrients move around within the plant. They're either in the ear or in the leaf, and I think the best balance is early head or boot stage. So. This is late November, and we've got the rams in. This is the ram in the foreground here. With the one herd, we got to be concerned with copper. We know that wool sheep are very sensitive to copper. With hair sheep, we really don't know the limit. I've been feeding 100 part per million copper for about 4 years now and hadn't had any issues, but I'm not recommending that people feed that because we need research to validate what the limit is. It's a cumulative effect, so it builds in the animal, so it could cause a problem at any time. But if we want to feed a high copper mineral, we'll feed that to the cattle or make it available to the cattle in a barrel hanging in a tree or hanging somewhere. And then we can run a 34-inch wire to hold back the calves and the cows and feed a more expensive sheep mineral or some kelp. We feed that time as well. Wanted to point out a grass that I'm really pleased with, and we oversee the hay feeding sites, and then we're extending. I used to not think it was a good idea to feed around the edge of the woods, but now we're trying to extend the grazing of the pasture into the edge of the woods. And this Prairie Bromegrass, the one I've used and had good success with, was persister. But it does real well on fertile sites, heavy manured areas, and shade, and it almost seeds as easy as annual ryegrass. So it's a very interesting plant. It has a longer growing season into the winter and into the summer than fescue, and we're in the heart of the fescue belt. This is that same site back in the summer before it was seeded, and actually it gets much worse than this, but here's the hogs too there. You can see all the integration with the dogs and the hogs and the cattle and the goats and sheep. So it's I'm going to go back to that to show you. It's just pretty amazing to me that it can do that, and it's a short-lived refeeding perennial. This Prairie Bromegrass is. And this is a little off topic, but I think it goes real well also. This is actually a garden. It's not my garden, but I'm working with a producer, and I told him to use some rye, cereal rye mulch, but he found ryegrass mulch, but on the left he used the ryegrass mulch, and on the right there was no mulch. And he did 3 reps, and he did a control spot, and we got 90% control of this spiny amaranth. So the point of all this is I've started seeding a little bit of annual ryegrass on these hay feeding sites along with the Prairie Bromegrass to get control of the spiny amaranth. And it seems to be working very well. It's not a year-long effect, but it does hold it back, whether it's the temperature or allelopathic or mulch, I'm not sure, but this was only like a 30% mulch in this particular garden. Hay feeding, little short story on this. These feeders, I've used these for a while now, and I used to have plywood bottoms on these feeders and fed alfalfa, and the alfalfa leaves would fall onto that wood, and the goats would refuse it. They wouldn't eat it. Well, I made them eat it by just leaving it in there, and then I got listeria. Now we put tin bottoms in these feeders, and they clean up every leaf, and of course that's the highest quality. And we try to make Sericea hay available to the goats and sheep most all winter. Rumen fill, I think, is very important in rotational management because we can yo-yo them if we don't watch it. But if we want performance, we want that rumen full at all times. So particularly when they're coming through the gate, moving to a new field. And it's easier to see on cattle than it is goats and sheep because of the hair, I guess. In the foreground, in the gate area there, that's nimblewheel, and that's also the reason that I planted this cocktail mix of annuals back here in the background. That's where the corn was back in the summer, and then I planted rye, oats, wheat, ryegrass, triticale, turnips, radish, and I even planted a little buckwheat in there. The idea was I knew I wasn't going to graze the buckwheat, but in 60 days it frosted and it killed the buckwheat, but I thought that tied in real well to the soil health, and it made a void for other root soil to get deeper in the profile. So we like diversity in all plants and animals. Here's the quick coupler. Main water source is just a pipeline with quick couplers, and then we put a portable trough with that. And here's the little 55-gallon portable troughs, and it's the quick couplers under the disc blade there in the picture. And the reason I started putting that disc blade on there is the animals could step off into that hole. So works real good, and not really that important for freezing, but it does help some there too. Oh, another point I wanted to make is we rotate the water point. Sometimes I won't let them have a water point, and what that does is, since the manure is mainly deposited around the water in the shade, some of my best forage is near the water points, whereas typically it's the overgrazed area. So to get a big response from the water point is rest it. In other words, don't let them have it every rotation. Another thing that we do that I don't think I've covered in here is we'll skip a paddock. Every rotation we'll think which paddock needs the longest rest and or needs a little more recovery, and so we always have one rested 60 to 90 days, so as a reserve paddock. Okay, back to the water, we'll put a chlorine tablet in a Gatorade bottle, and I got this from me and Mitchell Enos, and we just cut holes in the middle of the Gatorade bottle, and this helps keep the water clean. Not a total replacement for cleaning water troughs, but it does help, and you could even place these in the spring box and clean the pipeline if a person wanted to. And there's no issues with chlorine. If the first thing I understand would happen is the animals would reject the water, and we see tadpoles in these troughs, so we're not concerned with that. Oh, here's the pigs. They're what a hoot to watch. I thought they would root around a lot in the manure, and they rolled in it instead of rooting in it. And so all these pigs are covered in manure on the left, and had the same effect. It desiccated the manure where the flies couldn't breed in it. So the next thing is that I want to draw birds in, more birds. We've got a lot of wild turkey, but I want to bring in more birds. I don't want to raise chickens, but I would like to bring native birds in to pick through those piles a little more. I wanted to say too, when the acorns drop, the hogs, you better have the bottom wire hot. I didn't, and mine got away and were out for a month or more, but they love the acorns.
They turn into wild hogs then, don't they, Craig?
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I just had a question about your rotating of your paddocks, and how long do you rest them between regrazing, and then what's the average size of your paddocks based on your system there? So. Yeah.
In general, we'll rotate every 3 days and we'll rest 45 days, but, in the spring it'll be less days of rest. And we've moved now where we try to graze the top third during the growing season and take half, leave half in the winter. Then the size of the paddock, it varies a lot. We would love to be at 70,000 pound stock density year round, but I've got part-time help, and I'm not up there a lot myself, only 1 or 2 days a week. So, the paddock size, it'll vary from 4,000 pound stock density to 70,000. That's about our best way to answer it. And it's a very rolling farm or rough farm, so it's hard to. Does somebody have a question? Or?
Yeah, there's a question came in, but it seems like you're avoiding the chickens. Is there a reason that you don't include chickens in your rotation?
I'm more afraid of a chicken than a snake. No, they're a lot more labor too, so I know they would definitely be an addition to the system. I've got a kind of a standing offer for somebody to run chickens, and I'll buy the infrastructure if they'll manage them, and we'd split the profit or something out. I'd just like to have them, and I think they'll be worth the benefit, but I don't want to put the labor in. On the manure, I'm not going to get real deep into all these numbers, but there's an astronomical amount of nutrients in the manure if it hits the right place, and any crop can be fertilized with 100 cows for 11 days on 1 acre. There's your analysis right there. That's what we would be dropping is 256 pounds of N, 156 P2O5, and 572 of K2O. So that's over the top for most crops. So it's very valuable to manage it. We'll make, in a typical year, we'll make 6 rotations. So we'll graze about 18 days, but we're not at this stock density. And then the organic matter of the farm now averages about 4%, and that'll release about 90 pounds of nitrogen per year. And we feel like, I don't have a good baseline, but I did take some organic matter on some rotated cropland, and then the state average in Kentucky and Tennessee is about 2%. So we feel like in the last, the conservative would be 10 years, we've increased organic matter by 2%. Also, this moisture conservation with the more cover, residue management is very important, not only in cropland but in pasture land, to keep the evaporation down, cooler land, and more biological activity. And then the roots of your grass connect with the root of the fungus or hyphae and extend the whole root system. So tremendous benefits from raising the grazing height and doing the rotation and the residue management. This is how I do my water points. It's relatively easy. It's a lot of gates. These gates, I get them for about $70 or so a piece, and put up 8 gates around them, and we can rotate any direction we want to. The key is there's no post where these gates swing together, and I've got a schematic of this in the next slide. So there's no post where these 2 gates come together here. Here's your water point, and then fences come off here. So gives you lots of options. You could even water in multiple paddocks if you wanted to. Here's another gate arrangement that I use a lot, and the key is no post in the center, and the gates all come together. They could be anywhere on this radius, and you could have any number of fields, and we typically use 16-foot gates, and it'll make a 22.5-foot opening. Works real well. There's no water in the center of this one. It's no post. It's just for livestock flow. Predator control is a huge thing. It's probably the biggest hurdle, and as somebody pointed out earlier, the cattle give some predator control, but I wouldn't count on any one species or guardian for total control. This is Anatolian Shepherd in the upper right corner, and I love to see a dog that's overlooking them. It's even better if she was sitting right in the middle of them. And if you show up to buy a guardian dog, you want the one that's in the middle of the flock or herd. I think you should have 2 dogs minimum and 1 per 50. So if you had 150 animals, you'd need 3 dogs. But if you just have 50, you still need 2 dogs. The self-feeder, this is a big thing for people that are feeding remote. Use a shade cloth over, this is just over old dog carrier, and then there's a self-feeder in here. And I've been doing this about 2 years, and I hadn't had any sheep and goats go in to eat the feed. So this works real well. It's an 80-20 shade cloth. Like to have at least one donkey. Well, I shouldn't say it that way. It's best to just have one donkey per flock or one llama per flock or both, because if you get multiples, they just group together, and I don't know if they serve as well as a guardian. Although I broke that rule on the renting farm where I got excited when we had a hit, and I got 6 donkeys. So I've got donkeys for sale. I like to buy a donkey or a llama straight off its mother where it's looking for something to bond to. I think that works well. Guess that's it on that.
Wait a minute, Greg. You got a word up there I don't recognize. The word inophore.
Yeah, that's like rumensin or bovatec. Those are poisonous to donkeys or to equine or llamas, camelids.
Okay. And let me make a comment. I'm getting a lot of messages about folks not being able to see the slides or that they're not advancing. I apologize. That's not anything Greg's doing or we're doing. It's just a function of the server that it's coming off of, and there isn't anything we can do about it. But again, this presentation will be available to watch the replay, and you can have a copy of the presentation on your own computer later. So again, I apologize for that. So, okay, Greg, keep going.
Should I slow down or do something different? Or?
No, it's nothing you can do about it because they're advancing fine on our slides, and it's just, the magical world of computers and stuff, so we'll just go on.
Right. Okay. I will try to click them a little early and slow down just a little as I click through them if that works a little better. Grazing the woods, there's a lot of interest from particularly goat people in grazing the woods, and the recovery time is so long that in general, if you have less than 50% light getting to the forest floor, I wouldn't think of it as a paddock. I wouldn't want to invest in the fence. The recovery time, in my experience, is like 3 years or more. And you can see how goats really hone in on that browse in the woods. There's great grass out in the paddock, but they like that shaded woods area. And that's a common problem. I mean, all the species that I manage like the top of a draw where the drainage goes off, where it's shaded. And that I understand deer hunters say that that's where you find deer as well, because the deer like that cool air coming out of the hollow there. Goats and sheep waste a lot of hay, and this picture is showing that mushroom shape of a hay row, and this has been known to kill a lot of goats and sheep. It really should be pushed over when it gets to looking like this, and should have a rack around it. I just took this picture to show what can happen, and it can even kill a big goat. All right, targeted grazing. Just a few preferences, and I've already mentioned it, I believe. But there's clover in this picture, but the sheep went in for the buttercup. They really do well on the buttercup or like the buttercup. It doesn't seem to cause any issues for them. However, buttercup has a big growth spike in April, May, and there's no way they could keep up with it. So one way to address that is to graze a different paddock at that time of year each year and to set back the buttercup. Goats, the woody plants, of course, the briars and multiflora. Multiflora has tannins in it too and is a natural dewormer. Coralberry or buckbrush, people call it, those are other preferences. And ironweed, again, that's the key species I use for deciding stocking rate of goats, because the goats are more there for weed control on my place than as a meat producer, even though they're very healthy and do a wonderful job now, and we've culled them so hard that they're probably some of the healthiest stock I have. Cattle, of course, you can do some big impacts with them. And wing stem, they'll eat it better than the other species, but not as a preference by any means. But we can tromp it a little better with them. Okay, on the timing and marketing, we breed, the gestation's 5 months, so we breed in October, and our target is to have late February, early March lambs and goats, kids. The lambs are less prone to hypothermia than the kids, but the calves are even stronger. But we'll breed the cows in May, and we're targeting February 15 for the calves. And we don't have any shelter at any time other than the woods for the goats and sheep. You know, it's common for people to have that. We try to lay them out on a south aspect if possible, and try to not lamb or kid on the same pasture every year. It's tempting because you've got only certain south aspects. We typically sell the lambs and goat kids in December or January. I may move that back and sell a little earlier next year. That tends to be a high market. And then, again, on the cows, we run a low stocking rate of cows and keep the calves as long yearlings to about 800 pounds and sell in July or August. Again, that's a high month to sell typically. And we will let call some direct marketers if they're interested, and they can pay the previous week's price on the auction, and don't have to pay any commission that way. And this is the last slide, so we'll take any questions or comments.
If you'd like to ask a question, you can dial *1 on your phone to put yourself into the queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point you can state your name and your question. If your question is answered before we get to you, just dial *1 again, and that will take you back out of the queue. You can also use the Send Note button on the top toolbar and send your note to all moderators. And
okay.
I'm not seeing any questions on the line just yet.
I've got a question here. Someone was wanting to, they missed the discussion on the first gate arrangements for watering. Could you kind of maybe find that slide and talk about that a little again? Apparently their slides might have caught up with them.
Yeah, I think it's that one, David.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just a matter of hanging gates off of 4 posts pretty much, and they all swing. Let me go to the next one. They might, since it's not refreshing real well for them. And then I use the overheads. We don't go under the gates. This is just simpler, and I like to see my electricity, and we'll come back down at an angle with the wire, and we'll generally put a switch if we need to on those there. But yeah, I'll go to the next slide too. That's just an overhead aerial view of the gate arrangement around the water point.
Okay. I've had a question here about what might be your best grass or recommendations for drought conditions, or do you keep a sacrifice field, or what's kind of your drought strategies, or getting through those tough times like that? Yeah,
I need more warm season forage in my system. Sheep are graze low, so I'm not certain how well the native grasses would work. Eastern gamma grass is one of my favorite grasses, and I think it could work fine. Once you establish a stubble height with any grass, even fescue, they don't tend to graze so low. So there's lots of options right now. We're just doing the grazing corn for that. I'm looking at overseeding some crabgrass into the cool season paddocks. With goats, the native native grasses can work real well because they're top grazers. They graze from top down. So lots of options, and I think all of them are decent, and I wouldn't worry too much about quality as long as you graze or graze in my situation at the boot stage. It's going to be high quality.
Okay. A couple another question about your guard dogs. Wondering if there's any issues with the cattle accepting them, and then
that was our main concern early on was the guard dogs. And the dogs would run up and down the paddock next to the cattle and bark. And so one time we just said we're brave, and we just turned in the dogs and the cattle and the sheep, and we decided to give them a big 40-acre paddock get away if they wanted to. And they accepted each other pretty quick. But they'd been running across the fence for a month prior to turning them in. I would not pull up with a guardian animal and drop it out of the trailer into the cow herd. You'll have big gathering for cattle for a while.
Okay. Yeah. I got several questions coming in. I had another follow-up. Why the shade cloth on the dog food?
Yeah, that's to keep the goats and sheep from going into to eat the dog food, because there's a self-feeder in here.
Okay. All right, that's good. And then I got a question from somebody in northeast Pennsylvania, and they want to know what you would think the rotation time would be for that part of the country, their climate and so forth, as far as, I'm assuming that's rotating through to your grazing paddocks, that type of thing.
In Pennsylvania?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's going to be real similar. We've got the Appalachians down here, and they extend up there. I've been up in Pennsylvania. Of course, they're a little cooler, can grow some cool season grasses a little more. I really like the 45-day rest period, the target. But again, boot stage, try to be in there at boot stage or earlier, but not lower than 6 inches. And we rarely have this problem because I don't stock real heavy. I don't want the stress of high stocking. But if they tend to overgraze and you can't grow grass, you need to lock them down. And I don't like locking animals down. But if you're overstocked, you're going to need to lock them down to grow grass. So.
Okay, let me, operator, Emily, is there any questions come in over the phone?
I am not seeing any questions on the line.
Okay, well, I got a couple more, and then we'll maybe bring this to a close here. What type of crabgrass are you seeding, Dan?
The Red River is the one. They've got the Quick and Big now, but Red River crabgrass is the one I've seeded in the past, and the one that seems to. I'd probably do a mix actually of Quick and Big and Red River, but I'd bias it toward the Red River. The thing about crabgrass is the annual tillage. You could do it with high-density grazing, but it needs an annual disturbance, and that's a little hard to keep up with. And anytime you do tillage, you're releasing carbon, so I'm not real excited about having to do that disturbance. Okay.
And then you showed a picture about some grass and being grazed or seeded in the edge of the woods there.
Yeah, that's that Prairie Bromegrass. Matua, a lot of people tried it a few years back, and the remnant stands are in the shade when I go on people's places. Let's see if I can find that slide. I don't guess it matters. But
the question relates to how dense, how much the stocking rate, or how many trees, or how much shade can that tolerate?
Yeah. It would be, I'm thinking on the edge of the woods, you could go back 30 foot into the edge of the woods. But as far as in an open woods, probably at least 40% light coming through. Yeah, I'd rather have more, but at least 40%.
Okay.
Open canopy, yeah.
Is it one more question, and then we'll wind this up. Is there any other? You said you like the eastern gamma grass. Is there any other warm season grasses that you like?
Well, I know it's some people don't like this, but the improved Bermuda grasses, I've had real good luck with overseeding those with clover, and I get great palatability with them. So whether they're seeded or sprigged or cuttings, yeah.
Okay. All right, and then I'll ask the last question. How in the heck do you work this into NRCS's prescribed grazing standard? You've talked a lot about the management of things, but is this a challenge to meet our particular needs and as what our standard outlines, or do you find that our standard is flexible enough to accommodate a system like you described here?
Yeah, I mean, the grazing heights are respected, and the rest period or recovery period is respected. I think it fits right, actually better than just a single species. Less mowing,
Less mowing and more management. Okay.
More management, that's the main thing, but that's the fun part, is the management stuff.
Okay, and how many people you say it takes to run your operation?
I've got a high school guy that just graduated high school, and he works about 20 or 30 hours a week, and I'm up there 1 or 2 days a week. So.
Okay, so it's not labor intensive then?
No, it's not real labor intensive, but we've already got the fences in place pretty much, and we're doing some polywire and all, but it's not near. I mean, we're not doing hay, so it's a replacement of work. So.
Yeah. Okay, that's a key point there.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Greg, I appreciate your presentation. It's very informative. I'm sure the 250 plus people that logged in to listen to it got a lot out of it. I'm sure if you were to contact Greg via email, he would be glad to answer any further questions that you might have, since he is such an expert in this topic. Again, we do appreciate it, Greg, and appreciate your work you're doing. And I'm just curious, do you still do the calendar?
I do, yeah. Okay. We got a calendar on goats and sheep and one on cattle.
Yeah, which is an excellent. Last time I saw one about a year or two ago, it was an excellent publication. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Holly. And again, Greg, I appreciate your time and effort and look forward to working with you in the future.